let's talk about a return to normalcy in the 1920s. Now, last time we talked about the fact that normalcy is a flight of fancy. It's not going to happen after World War I, even though everybody wants to go back to the way things were. That's just not going to happen. And we saw some fairly dramatic changes in the 1920s. The emergence of jazz music, new forms of literature, changing perceptions on religion and science, and a division between those two things, and also the emergence and reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. Remember that it reemerges because, of course, it was around during the 1860s and 1870s, but I also say it emerges because, in some respects, it's very different, and in other respects, is much more successful than its earlier incarnation in the 19th century. And speaking of the 19th century, if you have to kind of think about this particular time period in any specific way, think of the Gilded Age 2.0. And we're going to talk a little bit about the politics of the 1920s and how you're going to see some very interesting and, in some respects, uncanny similarities to the 19th century and the Gilded Age. Some of the general similarities between the Gilded Age and the Roaring Twenties. You have this collusion between government and business. And of course, that happens officially where you have secretaries of commerce like Herbert Hoover, remember this guy. They'll go out of their way to kind of work with businesses to sort of advance government policy. But just like in the Gilded Age, we also see that the consequence of this is political scandals, corruption scandals, a la the credit mobilier scandal. You're going to see a lot of repetition there. It's also this period of Republican domination. In the sense that the Republican Party is the party to beat. And this is primarily because Americans kind of associate the Democratic Party as being the party of newfangled ideas, the party of World War I, and the party of radical change. And things have changed so much just within a few years, and by the way, wars tend to do that, that Americans are kind of growing nostalgic for simpler times. Um, it's also a time period where we see a return of the politics of the tariff, and we'll talk about that very, very briefly. Finally, Americans are becoming more isolationist. Again, anything to do with World War I is considered to be bad, and so Americans are now going to take very, very seriously Washington's farewell address, if you remember at the very beginning of the course. So the idea that Americans should basically stay out of entangling alliances and European affairs, and that's something else that kind of dominates the politics of the 1920s. Politically, the tone for the decade was set by the very first presidential election of the decade. So in 1920, it was widely speculated that Woodrow Wilson would seek a third term in office. But remember, fate, or at the very least, poor health care kind of intervenes, and Woodrow Wilson has a stroke and is unable to seek a third term. So what happens is that James Cox, a Democrat, and Roman Catholic, by the way, which is also historically interesting, runs for the Democratic nomination, wins, and becomes the Democratic Party's candidate. By the way, speaking of things that are interesting, look at his vice presidential pick, a young, svelte Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Look at that chin. Like, that's so sharp, you could stab somebody with it. Anyway, unfortunately for Cox and Roosevelt, ran basically on a platform that Woodrow Wilson would have approved of. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson did approve of the platform. A platform that consisted of the 14 points, or embracing the 14 points, the League of Nations, working with other countries to kind of ensure peace throughout the world, free trade, all the stuff that Woodrow Wilson was very, very keen on. But again, things that Americans were becoming more suspicious of by the beginning of the 1920s. So, Warren G. Harding, the Republican, runs on a platform of a return to normalcy. And he actually says, quote, America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. Now, that's, I guess, a decent phrase, and presidential elections have been won on a clever phrase. Remember William Henry Harrison's Tippecanoe and Tyler too phrase. But um, Cox and Roosevelt are betting on something. They're betting that the 19th Amendment, which was passed during a Democratic administration, would basically lead to this massive show of support from women at the ballot box. Because, of course, sarcasm, anytime you give a group of people the right to vote, they owe you something, right? And they're going to repay you or your party in kind at the ballot box, and that is not at all what happens. Republicans win the election of 1920, and indeed, women actually support Republicans more than Democrats, just across the board. So, what this leads to is the election of Warren G. Harding. So Warren G. Harding is elected, and not only does Warren G. Harding run on a platform of normalcy, he tries to embody normalcy. I mean, look at this guy. Um, he looks almost like adorable and harmless. He looks like, I don't know, a 1950s dad or grandpa. It looks like, this is a kind of guy who might agonize over being 5 minutes late or write a handwritten apology note if his library books are overdue. Somebody who's not particularly creative, but again, reliable, down home, and for the most part, Harding tried to kind of project that image. And again, whenever you see promotional images of Harding, you see him with family members. He also apparently liked to, at least this is what he said, he liked nothing more than to just take long Sunday rides out in the countryside. And by the way, speaking of a return to normalcy, this was particularly calculated because, of course, this is the same time period where cities and even the countryside are becoming more congested with the mass marketing of the automobile, specifically Henry Ford's Model T. So, in other words, Warren G. Harding tried to project the image of a person and a leader from a simpler time. Though, to be honest, as an equestrian and horse rider, he's got nothing on this guy. Anyway, poor horse. Yes, I went there. One of the things I should also mention about Harding, though, is that Harding, the image, Harding, the candidate, is very different than Harding, the person. And some of you were going, no, really? Yes, believe it or not, really. Politicians are not always upfront and honest about who they are. One of the things that Harding also liked to do is he liked to party it up in the Oval Office. Actually, not in the Oval Office. He did have standards. He would apparently go during Prohibition and drink and gamble with some of his cabinet colleagues like a hotel room on K Street, which is like right behind the White House. So that being said, though, Harding was somebody who certainly wasn't as much of a fuddy-duddy as he tried to portray, but at the same time was generally harmless. Because if Harding was honest about anything, it's the fact that he really didn't have any newfangled ideas. Basically, Harding is that person who is elected to office because that's just what people in his position do. He doesn't run for office because he has convictions or anything. It's just the reasonable next step. We're going to talk about how that actually creates problems in just a second. But let's also talk about some of what happens in the economy in the early 20s. So in the 1920s, we kind of see a shift away from the free trade of Wilson back to the tariff. Now, the thing is that of course, with Henry Clay and the American system, the tariff is, fairly ancient in U.S. history. But when the tariff is kind of central to U.S. economic policy, it's in an era where the United States is trying to industrialize, is trying to prevent foreign competition from basically crushing American manufacturing in its infancy. The world of the 19 teens and 1920s is very different. The United States is bar none the most industrialized nation on earth. So what happens is that right after World War I, the United States lowers taxes and instead relies more on the tariff as a way to basically fund the federal government and to protect American businesses. So the Fordney-McCumber tariff, and I don't necessarily know that it's incredibly important that you remember this particular tariff, but you should know that it raises the tariff rate about 40%. There are four really significant tariffs in U.S. history, and this is one of them. Remember, the others include the Tariff of Abominations in 1828, the McKinley Tariff, passed I think in 1890. The Fordney-McCumber Tariff is number 3, and finally, and the one you really need to remember, is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So the thing is that this tariff paves the way to what we call autarky. Autarky is this concept, this idea that nations should be self-sufficient. In other words, you shouldn't rely upon other countries for your energy, for your health care, for your consumer goods. That should be done all in-house. And of course, anytime people discuss autarky, the question is, well, what's wrong with self-reliance? Isn't self-reliance good? Well, remember that Woodrow Wilson believed, and he certainly wasn't the only person who believed this, that self-reliance makes it easier to go to war. If you're dependent on other countries for your goods, your services, your needs, you're going to think twice before you go to war. Now, the thing is that obviously we have to explain World War II. America's entry to World War II is actually pretty simple to explain. Japan bombed us on December 7th, 1941. That being said, the war itself, if we're looking at the war before America, the war that starts in 1939, it's actually a lot more complicated. And some historians have argued that autarky, the fact that countries kind of stop trading with each other because trade becomes too expensive, that is important in explaining why and how the war broke out. Of course, I don't want you to think that World War II is just because of this, but at the same time, that might be an important element in why the world goes to war again just a couple of decades after a comparatively disastrous war in 1914 to 1918. So I mentioned that Harding is in this kind of interesting position. He's not really elected because he has bright ideas or anything. He's elected basically because that's just kind of the logical next step in his career. Now, Harding was this very gregarious, outgoing, social animal. And so what Harding did is he would basically appoint his close friends and associates to cabinet positions. Now, the thing is that I'm not sure if you've ever had that experience where you have to do a group project with maybe your best friend or something, or I don't know, maybe you're just put in some kind of authority position over somebody you're close to. Now, on paper, it seems like that would be a good recipe for success, right? You know the person you're working with, you're close with them, you can level with each other theoretically, but very often it turns out to be a disastrous idea. I mean, your results may vary, but the thing is that friendship is kind of based upon a relationship of equality, or else it should be, right? Um, and so if you're dealing with a group project or anything with a final product, um, a lot of times what has to happen is that you have to create some kind of hierarchy. Somebody has to kind of take the responsibility for managing all or most of it. So, what that means for your friendship is you are transitioning from a relationship based upon equality to a relationship based upon hierarchy. And that can be a very difficult, if not impossible, transition. And that's what Harding is going to experience in the 1920s. Because again, he basically appoints most of his close friends and associates to basically supervise cabinet positions. The thing is that most of Harding's appointees weren't really interested in newfangled ideas either. They were really just interested in making a buck. There are tons of scandals we could talk about, but I'm going to limit it to the top three. The first scandal that erupted was a scandal involving Teapot Dome, which unfortunately has nothing to do with teapots, but everything to do with a naval oil reserve located at Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Apparently, Albert B. Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, had leased drilling rights to a private company so they could basically drill oil off of government land, which in most cases is totally legal if the government is receiving the cash. Well, Uncle Sam wasn't receiving the cash. Albert B. Fall was. And apparently, when Fall was living the life that would be usually too expensive for a government bureaucrat, a government official, the story broke. And in the days before Watergate, Teapot Dome was the greatest political scandal in U.S. history up to that point. Teapot Dome might have been the greatest corruption scandal in U.S. history up to that point, but for Warren G. Harding, it wasn't the only scandal. Things just got worse from there. There was a scandal that broke out in the Veterans Bureau, which is the predecessor to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Context: remember, Americans aren't too keen on the First World War, but Americans are keen on war veterans and making sure that war veterans receive the care that they earned fighting on the battlefield. Well, apparently, some officials at the Veterans Bureau didn't exactly get the memo because they were taking medicine, hospital equipment, that kind of thing, taking it and basically selling that stuff on the open market and pocketing the difference, just hoping that nobody would notice. Well, apparently somebody did notice. And of course, the story broke, and there's yet another scandal. And to make matters worse, you might remember our discussion of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer and the Palmer raids, in which individuals with immigrant backgrounds and or let's say radical political backgrounds were arrested, and in most cases their property was confiscated. And so the question was, what do you do with that property? What do you do with the property of German Americans who have been interned into camps or arrested or detained or whatever? What do you do with all of those assets that you seized? Well, if you haven't detected a pattern by now, you should, because Harding's Attorney General, Harry M. Dougherty, basically took that stuff and sold it, you guessed it, on the private market, and pocketed the money for himself. And so what happens is that Harding, who really doesn't really want to do much in the White House, he's basically held hostage by these corruption scandals. And Apparently, he says around 1923, quote, I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies all right. But my darn friends, they're the ones that kept me walking the floor at night. Well, by 1923, Harding doesn't have too much longer to worry about his friends or his enemies because he actually dies of food poisoning. And while obviously that doesn't imply that he dies because of stress related to these mushrooming corruption scandals, it's impossible not to draw the connection there somewhere. So Harding dies and is replaced by this guy.
Country needs every ounce of its energy to restore itself. The costs of government are all assessed upon the people.
That's right. My favorite president, and hopefully yours too, Calvin Coolidge. I mean, Harding and Coolidge had this great Ernie and Bert routine. Harding was gregarious. He was a party animal. And of course, during an age of prohibition and this, let's say, the emergence of social conservatism, Harding was anything but. He regularly drank with the Ohio gang behind the White House, and we talked a little bit about that. And of course, Harding, despite his socially conservative image, let's just say that he was very liberal with his affections. Um, that being said, though, um, Coolidge, by contrast, was very dull, painfully dull, uh, as you probably saw from the video clip a little bit. He had this voice that kind of sounded like nails scraping over a chalkboard. That's at least one description that I've heard. And Coolidge is this very sort of understated character. I also have to point out that um, most American presidents, especially in the 20th century, go on about how hard they work and how little sleep they get. Basically, an American president is basically like a sophomore or a junior in high school, where they're constantly going on about how they've pulled an all nighter. And of course, this is kind of the pattern rather than the exception. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama supposedly got anywhere from 4 to 6 hours of sleep a night. George W. Bush would usually get up at dark 30. Theodore Roosevelt, however, sort of outmatched them both. Apparently, sleeping only 1 to 2 hours of sleep each night. And after he got up, he would basically drink an entire pot of coffee and just move on with his day. This is why Theodore Roosevelt will always be my president. That being said, though, I'm pretty sure that Calvin Coolidge slept more as president than he was awake. Apparently, he would get roughly 12 hours of sleep a night, plus a rather generous nap in the afternoon. That being said, though, we tend to remember those funny stories about Coolidge more than his actual policies. So there's, of course, a famous anecdote, which we're not really sure actually happened, of Calvin Coolidge at a dinner. And apparently, Coolidge is very famous for being very taciturn and very reserved. And apparently, one of Coolidge's cabinet secretaries had a wife who made a bet that she could get Coolidge to say more than 2 words. And at dinner, she turns to Coolidge and says, So, I made a bet that I could get you to say more than 2 words. So, how about it? And reportedly, Coolidge looks at her and says, You lose. Coolidge apparently also loved nothing more than to um, basically buzz for the White House secretary to come in. And then once she walked in, apparently Coolidge would be hiding under his desk. I mean, he was kind of this prankster to a certain extent. Certainly not somebody that we would talk about in all seriousness, but Coolidge, the politician, was actually pretty considerable. And for those of you, and I know that there's always a few in every A-push class who like this guy, Ronald Reagan. Think of Coolidge as a warm-up act for Ronald Reagan. Because remember, Coolidge is a Republican. And historically, the Republican Party has always been the party of business and the party of government intervention in the economy. With Calvin Coolidge, we begin to see the emergence of, let's say, laissez-faire conservatism, where Coolidge really doesn't think that the government has much of a role in the economy at all. And to the extent that it does, Coolidge, again, while he's very taciturn, he could actually be almost poetic when describing American style capitalism. Quote, the chief business of the American people is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. Almost like this religious attitude towards American style capitalism. When Reagan is elected president in 1980, his political idol was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this is because Reagan grows up during the Second World War. And like many Americans during the Second World War, he sort of forms this almost personal connection with FDR. But the president whose portrait he puts up in the Oval Office was Calvin Coolidge. So, in other words, we begin to see kind of the emergence of modern American conservatism to a certain extent in Calvin Coolidge. Now, let me kind of explain what happens in the 1920s economically, because you get the impression that the focus of the 1920s was on the national economy. And remember that after the First World War, the United States is one of the few industrial nations of the world, actually, probably the only industrial nation of the world, that emerges relatively unscathed. The rest of the world is caught in this very deep recession. And to be honest, by the time 1929 rolls around, when the United States experiences the Great Depression, to be honest, the rest of the world has already been experiencing, if not a depression, then let's say reduced economic growth. Basically, World War I happens, and basically just nothing gets any better for the rest of the world. So if you look at what happens to the United States, though, um, in the 1920s, um, after the First World War, the economy goes through a recession. Now, almost any time you have a war, you see this buildup of economic activity, especially in a total war. But after the war, there's like this transition period where the factories that were producing tanks go back to producing automobiles, right? There's this sort of, again, this transition period. And that transition period very often leads to a recession. And the United States also experiences a bit of a recession from 1919 to 1921. And you can see this in the per capita gross national product. That being said, though, what the United States does is it cut taxes, it reduces spending down to a minimum, and basically it just rides out the recession. Now, of course, this leads to a few pretty bad years, but after 1921, the United States economy goes through this rapid recovery. And so what happens is that actually the period of the 1920s is one of the greatest periods of economic growth in US history. We'll find out how, in some respects, it's based on a lie. It's based upon, to a certain extent, a fiction. But if you look at the period from 1921 to 1929, um, gross national product increases from basically $60 billion dollars to almost $90 billion. Dollars. Wages, by the way, increase about 50%. So it's not as if all of this wealth is concentrated within just like the robber baron class or the upper class. You do see this genuine trickle down. It's also this period of investment in education. This is the first time in American history where a college education became a realistic expectation for members of the middle class. Remember that going to college was something that was only reserved, for the most part, for members of the upper class or the upper middle class. It just wasn't affordable to people outside of those social classes. But in the 1920s, we see for the first time this trend where Americans start going to college, and of course, that's a trend that will continue throughout the 20th century. Um, Illiteracy is halved, and this is also where education spending increases by a factor of four, which is really interesting to kind of juxtapose that, compare it to what's happening in Tennessee with the Scopes Monkey trial. On the one hand, we do see this pushback against science, but on the other hand, we do see this growth in education just across the board. Um, and this is also a time period where the United States stands as an economic colossus over the entire world. The U.S. Was responsible for over 1/3 of all industrial goods produced during this time period. And speaking of a third, roughly 1/3 of the American population invested in the stock market. So remember that the stock market was obviously, it's been a thing for a while. But even during the Gilded Age, investing in the stock market was something that only well to do Americans did. But by the 1920s, for middle class Americans, investing in the stock market was almost taken for granted. And the reason it was taken for granted is for a very simple reason: there didn't appear to be much risk. Remember that for the stock market, there is the promise of quick returns, of quick riches, but there's a lot more risk. It's, in some respects, I mean, it's not gambling, but it's gambling, right? But that doesn't necessarily hold true for all time periods in history. So, if, for example, you invested roughly $5,000 in General Motors stock, um, then by 1929, you would be a millionaire. I mean, just think about that. I can't math on the fly, but that's, a 20-fold increase in some change. Um, so the thing is that from what I understand, your investments are doing fairly well if they double every 10 years. And in the 1920s, Americans were finding that their investments were growing 20-fold over a 10-year time period. And of course, results varied depending upon what they invested money in. But at that point, well, where's the risk if you're making that much money that quickly? At that point, you're not playing it safe if you don't invest in the market. At that point, you're just a chump. But the question is, what happens to the American population if suddenly there's a downturn in the market? Because now over 1/3 of Americans have skin in the game. It's not just the robber barons who are kind of at risk if the market experiences a significant downturn. All was not well in the economy, though. For one, labor unions had less bargaining power than ever before. Samuel Gompers dies in 1924, the leader of the old AFL, and the person who replaces him, William Green, was less combative and adopts more conciliatory policies. Also, what businesses would do, whether it's the automotive industry, which was really kind of like the beating heart of the industrial economy during this time period, or any other business, what businesses would do is they would try to offer enticing benefits and pay to workers to basically convince them not to join labor unions. And so what happens is that the few labor unions that are really around and really effective are composed of more radical members. So labor unions are in many respects far less effective. And what happens is that we're also transitioning from this time period where Woodrow Wilson, in many respects, kind of supported labor unions, to this time period where labor unions aren't really supported as much. The other thing that we kind of see is that while industrially, the American economy is more effective and more efficient than it has ever been. But if you look at rural areas, the very areas that are wanting a return to normalcy, you get a very different picture. Whether it's the price of cotton or the price of corn, you see that the price of farm goods throughout the country is starting to decline. And to be honest, when the Great Depression rolls around in 1929, for the American farmer, that depression has already been a reality to him or her during this time period. So, what farmers have to do to combat the decline in food prices is they have to basically overproduce. They have to grow so much stuff and hopefully sell some more stuff to basically make up for their losses. And we'll talk about the consequences of that policy a little bit later. So what happens though is that by the end of the 1920s, again, you see this extraordinary high standard of living, where the country is wealthier than it has ever been before. For a politician, for example, like Calvin Coolidge, a strong economy is basically the best predictor of whether they're going to be reelected. Now, in 1928, it might boggle the imagination, but Calvin Coolidge, who has served for part of Harding's first term, who has been elected in his own right in 1924, Calvin Coolidge has the opportunity to apparently take a third term if he wants it. How does that work, you ask? Well, remember, the economy is spectacular during this time period. Why wouldn't Americans want a continuation of that? But apparently, in 1928, Calvin Coolidge decides to call a press conference. And I mean, a Calvin Coolidge press conference was kind of a rare thing in itself. And apparently, the reporters lined up to hear Calvin Coolidge speak. But Coolidge sort of put a twist on it because Coolidge's idea of a press conference wasn't him speaking. Instead, what happened is the reporters would line up at a desk where Coolidge was sitting, and he would hand each of them like a little 3x5 note card that contained the following message: I will not run for the presidency in 1928. And apparently, Coolidge just announced this without telling any of his cabinet members, without telling his vice president. This was just kind of a spur of the moment decision. So, this might be another example of getting punked by Coolidge, which again wasn't that rare during his presidency. But his daughter gives us a very different story. Apparently, Coolidge's daughter calls up Coolidge's wife, and Coolidge's wife tells the daughter to sell her stock because Papa says there's a storm coming. Papa says there's a depression coming, and we'll talk about that next time.